Thank you, Colleen, and thank you to all of the presenters in this session. I've learned a lot and it's been really helpful and informative. So I'm going to be talking about a very different context. I'm going to be talking about the American context, but in particular the state of Texas and the context, because that's where I've worked. So the first half of my talk is going to be on the context so that you understand where I'm going to be coming from when I start to talk about, in the second half of the talk, about teaching out of field. So the first part's on data governance and the context, and the second part will be specifically on teaching out of field. So to give you a sense of my background, I'm not a traditional academic from the standpoint of, I actually work for a state education agency that oversaw the primary and secondary schools in the state of Texas. My department was responsible for conducting research to inform state policy and as well as program design. My department also built the state's research data warehouse. So I'll talk more about this later, but we built a data warehouse that's specifically for researchers. Now, in the last 10 years, I've worked for Texas State University. It's one of the largest teacher preparation programs in America. We prepare between 700 and 800 teachers every year. My role is to conduct research and evaluation of the teacher prep program for program improvement standpoint. I also do a lot of work in data governance, both at the local university level, but also at the state level. And I co-lead a research teacher preparation program partnership where we conduct research on behalf of the 20 largest teacher prep programs in the state. So that gives you a sense of where I'm coming from. I've been doing research with the Texas education data for the last 15 years, and most of it's been quantitative, but quantitative also with mixed methods. And I do a lot of work with big data, as you'll see. So the Texas context, to give you a sense, is Texas is about the size of New South Wales, but we have 5.5 million primary and secondary students in government schools. We don't keep good track on the students in the primary, in the non-public schools. But this gives you a sense of the size of the student population that we have. The majority of the students in the system are non-white. And we have 125 different home languages spoken. So it's not an English primary or English and Spanish primary because we're on the Mexico border. We have 125 different languages that are spoken. You understand rural context. We have very rural schools in Texas. We have one school district that's bigger than the state of Victoria, but it only has 14 students. And then our largest school district has over 210,000 students. So the state spans the extremes from very small to very large. But the unique thing about Texas is we have had a very robust data system since 1991. So we've been collecting extensive data on our education systems for the last 30 years. So the focus of my talk today is going to be on what data are needed to inform policy and what data collection strategies are needed and by whom. So those are the two questions that I'm going to specifically address. So what data are needed? The work that we do in Texas is focused on the collecting the data so that it aligns directly with our educational goals. So I'm not going to answer the question for the Australian context, but I'm going to raise the question, what are your state and national goals for education? Start with those goals, and then that should determine what data need to be collected. In Texas, here are our four primary goals, or four of our primary goals. So first is ensuring compliance with laws and rules, both state laws and federal laws around education. Second, it's providing schools with adequate funding. So a lot of the data that get collected are around the issues of funding. Data are collected. One of the major goals is ensuring student learning and student equity, and then also ensuring that the teachers are qualified to teach the classes that they're teaching. So these are four of the primary goals, and these are the goals that drive a lot of the data collection. So here's an example, and our Texas Education Code is our legal, it's our statutes, our laws that govern what happens in the state of Texas. And I put specific language from one of the sections of code, and it says the agency, meaning the education agency, shall administer and monitor compliance with education programs required by federal or state law. So the state policy, the state law says that this agency is required to monitor compliance with state and federal law, including federal funding and state funding. So this one little section of code requires the agencies to do all the data collection to ensure compliance. The second part here, the agency shall conduct research, analysis, and reporting to improve teaching and learning. So both of these are aligned with the state's goals, and it drives much of much of the data that is being collected in the state. So I was looking at the Victoria laws, and I looked at the Education Training and Reform Act, and there's a section in there that is similar to this first part about supplying information to the minister. So it looks like some of the similar rules already exist, at least in Victoria. So the data collection, we, in Texas, the primary and secondary schools report all of their data to a system that's called PEIMS, the Public Education Information Management System, or PEIMS for short. So each school district is required to participate in PEIMS and is required to provide information about their students, their teachers, all their employees through this system. Okay, and you can see at the bottom part of this code, it says, for the administration of this chapter and all other appropriate provisions in code. So basically, anytime a law, an education law gets written, there is a provision in that law that says, you're going to provide the data to the state education agency for the purposes of monitoring compliance and funding and equity and things like that. So this seems similar to the cases 21 system, seemed like it was similar to PEIMS. But the PEIMS system is what we call a state longitudinal data system. So it's, as Helen was saying just a few minutes ago, the longitudinal nature of data. We've been collecting data in Texas about all of our primary and secondary students for the last 30 years. So we can tell you every student who's enrolled, what schools they're enrolled, their demographic characteristics, all the services they've received since 2011, all of the classes they've taken, the grades they've earned, and all of their statewide assessments. So for all of the primary subjects that are tested in the state. We also have up to 60 years worth of teacher data. So every educator can hold multiple licenses for multiple subjects and multiple grade bands. All of these licenses are held centrally. So we know who is capable of teaching what. We know what degrees they hold. We know what classes they taught and who the students were in those classes each period, each semester throughout the entire year. We also know what salaries they're making and a host of other things that we know within the PEIMS system. So the PEIMS system existed, but it was only the agency and agency researchers who had access to this. So in 2007, the state created a P20W research state longitudinal system. And what that means is basically from early childhood through workforce and retirement. So all the data for primary and secondary students and educators, all the post-secondary students, universities, colleges, medical facilities that did training, and all workforce data are contained there. So we know what industries people work in, what their wages were, so we can track them from preschool to retirement if they have lived in the state of Texas the entire time. Okay, the research, because of the desire to protect the confidentiality of all the people in the state, and to make these data available to researchers across the United States, there are detailed processes and rules for protecting the confidentiality of the data and the people. And there's no personally identifiable information contained in the warehouse, but you can track an individual across time, across the 30 plus years. So I can't know who a person is other than the specific ID that they have in the research data warehouse. So I've been doing most of my research in this research center. So now some about the American context as it relates to teaching out of field. So the federal legislation was called No Child Left Behind, and in 2001, it essentially made teaching out of field illegal in the core subjects. There were rare circumstances under which it was permissible, but there were a number of steps that the school district would have to go through in order to put a teacher into a class that the person was not qualified to teach. So from 2001 until the end of 2015, out-of-field teaching was illegal, and then the federal law changed in 2015 to the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. ESSA legalized out-of-field teaching. But it said that the distribution of out-of-field teaching had to be equitable. So white students and non-white students had to be taking roughly the same number of classes out of field. Poor and wealthy students had to be equally treated. Rural, urban, suburban, didn't matter where you lived, there had to be an equitable distribution of out of field teaching. So my colleague Amy Pia and I did a study where we looked at, is this happening? Is there equity in the way students are taking classes out of field as required by federal law? And what we saw is when the out of field teaching was illegal, there was a low number of classes that, or lower percentage of classes that were being taught out of field. And once it was legalized, there's been a dramatic increase, almost exponential increase in the number of classes that are being taught out of field now that it's been legalized. We found that students are not equitably taking classes out of field. As Paul said, the students in the rural communities, the same thing is happening here. Students in rural communities are taking classes out of field at a much higher rate. And it varies dramatically by subject. But we also found that teachers are not equitably assigned out of field classes. So we found differences in the type of preparation teachers went through. Black teachers were treated differently from white teachers, and things like that. So the longer ESSA is in effect, the longer the federal policy is in effect that legalizes teaching out of field, the more classes are being taught out of field in the state of Texas. So the most recent work that I've been doing has been done to look at, okay, so we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of classes being taught out of field, but is that impacting students? Is that impacting students negatively? So what I did is I started with 235 million records of every secondary student, every class that they took, and the teacher who was assigned to that class. Because we have detailed licensure records, I also knew whether or not that teacher was teaching in field or out of field. I started by selecting just the maths in the different grades, English, reading classes. So I started with the first 7 courses you see listed here. And I determined out of field teaching sorry, and then the state end of course exam. So each of these students in each of these grades and each of these subjects has to take a test at the end of the school year, and the test is aligned with the curriculum that's taught. So unlike the research that's been done with the PISA or the TIMSS, the test is actually aligned to the curriculum that's required to be taught in the different years and different subjects. And the exam is at the end of the class. So determining the legal status of a teacher using the detailed state rules, I mapped the teacher licenses to the course subjects. And this is what it looks like. There's a 90-page document in Texas that shows you what licenses you can hold as a teacher and then what classes you can teach. So if you wanted to teach English in English 1 through 4, so this would be equivalent to year 9 through 12, I think, or 8 through 11, something like that in Australia. I'm still trying to figure out the translation. But if you held any one of these licenses, then you are qualified to teach these 4 subjects at the secondary level. So I used the rules for who was legally allowed to teach each subject to determine in-field and out-of-field status.
2 minutes to go, Jim.
Okay. I did a hierarchical linear modeling with 3 levels that controlled for differences among students, teachers, schools, things like that. And the results were that in every single grade, every single subject that I've looked at so far, students are hurt by out-of-field teaching. They experience significantly less academic growth in each of the subjects if they're taught by an out-of-field teacher than by in-field. So to put this in perspective, in Texas, we'd have to eliminate poverty for 3.4 million students, and yet that would only have half of the effect of eliminating out-of-field teaching. So this is the effect of out-of-field teaching on students is dramatic. So what I wanted to do is to put it into the Australian context, look at the TIMSS results and apply the Texas findings to give you a sense of the scale of the impact using the TIMSS data from the ACER report in 2019. So in the year 4 performance for math, the students in Australia scored 516, and Australia was ranked 27th in the world. If we apply the Texas results to the Australia data, then the score would increase for the country to 548, and you would be ranked 9th in the nation at year 4. You'd be tied with Ireland, just to give you a sense of what the scale of the differences I'm talking about in Texas. So year 8, the score was 517, Australia was ranked 10. If we took the results from Texas, you would score a 571 and be ranked 6th in the world. So we're not talking about small effects here. We're talking about very large effects that we're seeing. And these are the kinds of results that we can determine because we have the high quality longitudinal data that are aligned with our state and federal goals. So to have an effective education system, you must have clear goals. So it's got to start with the goals. Then you need high quality and high actionable data. Actionable meaning that the data helps you know what part of the system needs to change to get closer to your goals. And you need research to inform practice and policy. So in Texas, we built a specific data warehouse for researchers to help inform state policy and state practice. So here's my contact information. Thank you very much for attending.